Welcome to another edition of the Business of AI podcast. And I'm delighted to be joined this morning by two special guests who are going to be talking about their book. So I've got Ray Eisel Porter and Dr. Paul Donga, who are joining me today. And we're going to be finding out a little bit more about them and the book that they've written, which is all about governing the machines. So Ray, I know you've got a background as an academic as well as a consultant and bringing together a rich history in the sort of the business sector. And Paul, you're at NatWest, so I'm really sort of fascinated to hear a little bit more about how you came together to write this book. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourselves and how you met and how you came up with the idea. Ray, shall I come to you first?
Yeah, absolutely. I used to work for Accenture. I was their global lead for responsible AI and designed and implemented Accenture's global AI governance program. After also having led their AI and data business in the UK. I left Accenture probably about a year and a half ago, I guess, and that was primarily to write this book. And I started on the journey because I felt that there were an increasing number of organizations that I was seeing that were struggling to have the confidence to use AI. They saw the benefits, they wanted to use AI, but there was nervousness about AI going wrong because we saw plenty of examples in the press and so on of mishaps. And there really wasn't a book on the market that gave a very clear blueprint to business leaders about how would you secure AI, what sort of governance program would you put in place, and literally a sort of, here's step one, step two, step three, a guide to how to do that. And after starting work on the book, I realized that I would really benefit from collaborating with someone who is deeply technical, because obviously, you need to understand some technical tools and platforms and things that might be used as part of the governance. And that's when I reached out to Paul, who I'd known for a number of years. We'd often come across each other speaking on panels and so on. And I knew that Paul had a PhD in AI. So he was the perfect companion to help me on the sort of technical side of things. And then we also decided that it would be helpful to have a trained lawyer. Although we have a good understanding of the law, we thought, well, we really ought to actually have a lawyer involved if we're going to write about the law, which obviously you need to cover as well. And so we reached out to Miriam Vogel, who also brings a US perspective. So she's a law professor in the US, has a legal background, but was also President Biden's chair of the National AI Advisory Committee. But it was very helpful to have someone with a trained legal background to contribute to the book as well.
Great. And Paul, could you maybe help us kind of understand how you've come on this journey and where you've contributed as well, and your background?
Yeah, of course, Tim. Well, thank you. And it's lovely to be on here. As Ray mentioned, I have a bit of a background in AI. I actually did a PhD in agentic AI, no less, in the 90s, the 1990s. So there was a thing, although it was there was only a few of us around, I think it's fair to say. So I've always been fascinated in AI. I did research at university and I used to teach it. But I then moved into financial services because in the mid-90s, it was one of those AI winters where funding had dried up and it really wasn't going to deliver what people expected. So actually, I moved into financial services and I stayed there for about 20 years, always being technical, Tim. I'm a computer scientist by trade, building large systems for banks, often in the risk space, which is a large part of what banks do. And building calculation engines and risk reporting engines. So quite complex systems. And about 2018, I started hearing a lot more about AI, a lot in the press, in the media. And I started thinking, hold on, what's happened here? And I quit my career in the city. I then got into AI ethics, which is really, really important, which is actually the genesis of my role in the book. It's all about the safety of AI. I work for Lloyds Bank as head of data and AI ethics. I'm now working at NatWest Bank as head of what's called responsible AI and AI strategy. And as Ray said, we've met numerous times at various conferences. And Ray kindly approached me in the summer of last year and said, Paul, I'm semi-retired. I'm going to write a book, and would you partner with me? And I said, I'd be absolutely delighted to. Took me about 1 second to say yes. And then the journey began from there, Tim. And a lot of what's in the book is for me is really special, really important, because it brings out a lot of the work that I'm now doing, and also allows me to talk about some of the things that I guess I was thinking about in the 90s, but not actually really writing down in this way. So it's been wonderful, really good.
Great. Well, I'm really looking forward to unpacking so many of those things you mentioned there. But one thing I wanted to just kind of focus on or ask you about was the agentic AI that you mentioned in the 1990s. And you mentioned some of those winters that AI has been on since, well, you could say since the 50s, when it was really sort of conceptualized and started to come in existence, really sort of took off in the 70s. But what did agentic AI look like in the 90s?
Well, I have to say, Tim, it was fairly theoretical because we didn't have the compute that we have now. So a lot of the people that were doing research in agentic AI were in fact modeling the behavior of systems, often using mathematics. So my PhD is full of hieroglyphics and Greek letters. And it talks about the idea that you have a thing that is intelligent, that is autonomous, and that reasons through primarily logic. So it's a way of reasoning that we spoke about back in the day, which was talking about how one logical fact follows from another. So if you think of if then else rules, it was all modeling how agents would work through sets of rules and then go about creating plans to do things, decompose a plan, and come back with answers. So my doctorate focused on on how you get agents to behave rationally. So rationality, which drew on sociology, organizational theory, and philosophy, was behind some of the research that I used to do. So we want to define what is rational behavior for an agent. And it's interesting, actually, how relevant that is now. Now it's in the shape of how do we control an agent so it does the right thing? My work was about how you make sure an agent is rational when in its behavior. So it's actually quite interesting. So that was really, there were no LLMs. We didn't have this massive compute. We couldn't really make it real. Although there were some people that were flirting with kind of old AI and trying to make systems pass messages between them. That was happening quite a lot in the US, actually.
Yeah, well, I love that. And it takes me back to my 90s experience of studying philosophy, psychology, and physiology, and which is a real sort of overlap of a lot of those things you were talking about then. But in this experimental psychology, it was all about building neural networks to try and mimic the physiology of the brain. And then we were getting into some of the philosophy of what that subconsciousness meant. But in fact, there's this whole area of AI just touches upon so many of those sectors. And maybe we should do a whole other podcast another time looking at maybe the philosophy of it. But just coming back to the book kind of focus here, because I want to get into some of the questions around governance. That is one of the big things that when we talk to businesses that they do struggle with. And Ray, you mentioned this was why you came up with the idea for this book. It's often hard for them to know where to start. I think almost like the smaller the business, the bigger the burden is relative to the resources they've got available. But even for those large organizations, then you get into the complexity of governance. So, I mean, obviously your book is a guide to how to do that, but could you help us understand, some high level guidance on how do you get started, Ray?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing is from a mindset perspective, it's thinking about AI governance as an enabler for using AI and not as something that's trying to stop you using AI. So Paul and I and Miriam, we strongly believe in the value of AI as long as you do it correctly. And what we want to do through governance is to give people the peace of mind that they can sleep at night knowing that you've done the right kinds of checks and controls. And so you can be confident that the AI will deliver what you want it to do. And ultimately, that's what governance is about. So that also includes thinking through the use cases and making sure that it's a sensible thing to do with the AI that's going to give you a good return on investment. And clearly, if the AI goes wrong in some way, it's not going to give you a return on investment. So we would suggest that you do need to start with a few guiding principles and a policy. That's where most people start. That's really easy to do. There's lots available on the internet, that you can just adapt to suit your own organization. What makes it come to life, though, is actually the process around that will make sure that people go through the governance steps. So that's about first of all, identifying what we call checkpoints in the business. So where can you ask the question, does this new thing that you want to do, does it include AI? Now, that might be somebody internally developing a new system, a new model, some sort of new service or product, or it might be purchasing from a third party. But you need to ask that question, is there AI in this? And obviously, increasingly, there is AI. If there's AI, you then want to ask a sort of risk triage question, which is, well, what's it going to be used for? And then you need some sort of scale of risk. So clearly in health, in financial services, a number of areas, the risk could be quite high, depending on what you're doing with the AI. And in other areas, much lower. And if it's a low risk area, fine, just get on with it. But if it's a high risk area, then we have a set of different questions and assessments that you would want to go through to make sure that you're not open to any of the risks that we identify and discuss within the book. I guess the other point I would just mention there in terms of where to get started is actually having someone who's going to take the lead. This isn't something you can do in a silo in one area of a business. It needs technical people, it needs legal people. If you've got a risk and compliance department, it'll need them, it'll need procurement, HR. So you've got to have a senior leader who has the clout and the political will, if you like, to bring those different groups together, a bit of budget. But you don't have to have a huge budget if you're a smaller organization. There's ways that you can scale this down to suit your size. But you do need to have someone who's committed, who's going to lead it and drive it through.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for taking us through those steps. It feels like that the first place to start there is understanding what the business's objectives are, and then start to sort of unpack those and frame the problem. And then you were talking a little bit about sort of analysing and auditing where the business is at the moment, and trying to then understand the risk, the risks that could be very unique to that particular business, or the products and services that they're creating. And then I love the point there you were talking about in terms of actually having someone to own that. I think accountability is so important in an organization. I wonder whether just on that point, I could get your perspective on whether you think businesses should have a chief AI officer. And I'll come to you first on that, Ray, and then maybe come over to Paul as well, because I'm sure you've got perspectives on this in being in large organizations. But does that chief AI officer, does that help with that accountability in setting out those frameworks?
I think it can do, absolutely. And I mean, there have been surveys done, etc., which show that the number of organizations which have a chief AI officer is increasing quite significantly. You'll also have some organizations that have a chief responsible AI officer. Now, you've probably got to be quite large for that to be worthwhile. But if you have a chief AI officer, he or she would be a logical person to drive this sort of agenda forwards, as well as obviously being accountable for getting value out of AI. And that combination, if you can have the same person driving value and also driving the governance, that's quite a good balance, I think.
Yeah. And Paul, is that your experience as well, kind of working in particularly financial services? Because I imagine the risks there are also something which feature fairly highly in any of these frameworks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I very much agree with Ray. And what we're seeing a little bit of is the old chief data and analytics officer role being transformed somewhat into the chief AI officer. So data and AI rather than data and analytics. And AI is kind of seen as part of the analytics work. So it's natural for some organizations to subsume that role into the chief data and analytics officer role. But on the whole, I actually agree with Ray. I think the chief AI officer is a separate role. And the reason I say that it's so important is because the risks of artificial intelligence are cross-cutting, right? They cut across security, privacy, legal, ethics as well. So it's multifaceted. And also, I believe if AI continues to be deployed at the scale it is, that it really does need to be taken super seriously at the board level, and someone with a real hardcore skills in that discipline should really lead it, with potentially the responsible AI piece being under their mandate. So you could have a responsible AI officer actually working for the chief AI officer. So you're kind of governing and managing the risks as part of the strategy as well. Those were my 2 points on it.
Yeah, thank you. And thinking about this from a generative AI perspective as well, because that's the area that I think actually most people will have had to play around with. And you ask the person in the street, it's the type of AI that they'll have heard of as well. But within the financial services, is that creating even more risks by its very nature, because you can't really sort of predict what's going to happen there? And one, you've got this sort of shadow usage, but also you've got things like hallucinations, and you've got all these kind of additional problems. Is it causing much more of an issue within financial services?
Well, I think in any industry, Tim, that uses generative AI, I mean, generative AI has increased the risk landscape. So you mentioned 2 there, and one of them is that the most well-known one, so-called hallucinations. The fact that this kind of AI is generative, it creates new content, brings with it a number of risks. And we go into each one in considerable detail in the book. So the risk landscape has broadened or widened. It's actually slightly deeper as well, because some of the existing risks have actually got a little bit worse as well. And agentic AI, I believe, has actually taken that yet another step further. It's almost like the more capability these systems have, the more complex tasks they could resolve. With that comes actually more risks. That seems to be the way this technology has developed, Tim.
Yeah, you've mentioned agentic again, so maybe we'll dive into that quickly, and then I'll maybe sort of bring Ray back in again as well to talk about these sort of overarching frameworks. But Paul, on the agentic side, it is one of those things that has just surfaced really in the last year. And now it's everywhere. I definitely get the sense that people are rushing, like they were rushing to adopt AI without really thinking about framing the problem. They're rushing to find the solution, which is agentic, because everyone else is doing it. There's a bit of FOMO going on there as well. But then the risks you talk about are being magnified because people are rushing. They're not really thinking about it. And there's all these additional vulnerabilities within any of those agentic systems. So what would be your advice for companies who are thinking, I've got to get agentic in now, I'm late to the game, they're rushing? How can they make sure they minimize that risk threshold?
Well, first of all, headline advice is you're not missing out. Right? So please, put the FOMO to one side. When I hear people talk about agentic AI, when I read consultancy reports from some of those other consultancies, and I hear them write, this kind of AI is autonomous, can do planning, can do reasoning, and tackle, figure out how to solve a problem on their own. That's really quite misleading. That was actually what we aspired to do with agentic AI back in the 90s. And we haven't built that. We had ChatGPT launched in November 2022 through the transformer architecture. That was a step change, right? That had nothing to do with agentic AI. What seems to have happened, in my personal opinion, is people have latched onto generative AI and thought, look, hold on, you can interact with it in natural language. You can get a response in natural language. So isn't it really straightforward to therefore see that agents can talk to each other because they're just passing natural language, which is their interface? So let's string these together. Another development was this chain of thought reasoning. So chain of thought in large language models has been introduced in the last year or two. And again, Tim, it's a very unfortunate word because it implies that the agent is thinking by the use of the word thought. It's really, and what's actually happening is you pass a prompt to a model and it decomposes the prompt and says, okay, to answer this prompt, I'm going to do the following things. So there's kind of a template in there that it follows to do the things that you've asked for, which is often very, very sophisticated search. Actually, when we look at chain of thought, what it does really well is chain of thought, is search. So with those two in mind, we haven't got full autonomy. We haven't got problem solving. We haven't got planning and decomposition of plans and hierarchy. All of those things still need to be worked out. And even if they can be worked out, let's put it this way, even if they can be, you still need to make that agentic AI system suitable for your organization. And suitable for your organization means following policies, respecting security constraints, data access constraints, of which there are loads, authentication. There are so many things that go around the way organizations, certainly large organizations like banks, work. The complexity is there and the policies there, really govern how that organization works. You can't just throw something called agentic AI and say, right, that's going to be fine. We'll tweak it here, we'll tweak it there, and it will be just fine. And we don't need to employ a whole load of people and da 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 da. I think we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. And I think people aren't really understanding the complexity involved and the risks. So I think we've got a long journey on that front.
Yeah. Good advice. I think that's always worthwhile, really looking at what it actually can achieve rather than what people are saying it will achieve. And Ray, on the point about governance there, so when a company or when someone, chief AI officer, whoever's responsible for creating these governance frameworks, when they're thinking about how they set those out, how can they ensure that the principles are going to be flexible enough to deal with what might be coming a year or two from now when we don't even know what it's called, or it might be the next version of agentic that's kind of actually starting to have some of those capabilities that Paul was outlining? How can we ensure the governance framework's flexible enough for that?
So maybe two points to say on that. One is a sort of purely practical point. A lot of organizations have an AI policy or multiple AI policies, or rather, if you have multiple, they don't have specific policies for AI. But for example, in financial services, there are lots of policies already in place that govern the way that people do things in the bank. And rather than having some new AI policy, the best answer is to review your existing policies and figure out which ones need to be updated to account for AI. But policy changing is quite hard, typically. It's a fairly lengthy process, usually, to get it approved. So one trick there is to use what some organizations call a standard. It's a lower level document beneath a policy. And the policy says, you need to go and look in this standard to tell you the ways of doing certain things. And the standard can be updated much more easily by a local team or a person as, let's say, a technology changes or some small change happens in the regulation. So that gives you a bit more flexibility to adapt to things as they move forwards. But I think the biggest point I would make is that actually having a governance foundation in place gives you the scaffolding on which to build as things change, because inevitably regulations will change, the technology will change, what your company does with the AI will change. All these things are going to move. And as an example, I was at an event talking to a group of 50 odd senior lawyers just after ChatGPT had come out. And one of the questions that was asked of the audience was, so, how have you all reacted to ChatGPT in your company? And as you may remember back then, Tim, a bunch of companies just shut it down completely. They said, whoa, this is super risky. We'll get the CIO to turn off any, to block it and so forth. And what we noticed was that the companies that had no existing AI governance or data governance processes in place were typically the ones that had to do that knee-jerk reaction and just shut it down completely.
Interesting.
The companies that already had some kind of data governance or maybe AI governance in some form were able relatively quickly to review that and say, well, okay, we now need to introduce an extra, question here. We need to update this training. We need to maybe put out a new policy or something on it. It was relatively straightforward because the scaffolding was there. And that would be our view. We tried really hard in devising the frameworks in the book to think about making them flexible enough that they can adapt and be changed as things move forwards.
That's really interesting. And it aligns with something that we've often found talking to businesses who have gone through digital transformation already. Mm-hmm. So, back 10, 15 years ago, I was working in helping businesses go through that first wave of digital transformation. And we talked about the things like, how to have that mindset of being curious, being agile, resilient, being iterative and data-driven, all of those good things, right? But creating not just the mindset, but the culture across the organization. And we find now that the companies that have gone through that digital transformation, for them, AI is just another technology. So they just they were able to adapt to it pretty easily, and it wasn't like a big thing. And they're the minority of the companies who've gone through that. There's still the majority haven't gone through that. And so then when they're trying to adapt to AI, it's like, suddenly panic. It's because no one's quite knows. They don't have a framework. They don't have the culture. They don't have the people and those processes in place. And I hadn't thought about it from a governance perspective, but it sounds like it's the same problem, right? And they just haven't built that governance structure, but which they probably would have done back in the digital transformation days.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think your example illustrates more widely, businesses need to be flexible these days. Everything's changing. Everything around us in the world is changing faster and faster and faster. So I think you mentioned agile and flexibility were a couple of the words you used in your description of the digital transformation. Strikes me those are key characteristics of any organization these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the people part is the really interesting bit, isn't it? Because Paul, from your perspective, you're a technologist and you can understand how the technology has evolved and what the potential of it is. But you're also an ethicist in terms of understanding the ethics, and we talked about philosophy a bit in the preamble as well, which is really the human part of this as well. And it strikes me that actually all of this really comes down to human problems or human challenges, things that we need to kind of fix with humans. But what would be your perspective on the role of the human within this governance, and how your governance framework actually sort of empowers those humans?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So for me, the governance framework, well, let me take a step back. In some areas, the word governance is kind of getting a bit of bad press. For some organizations, it feels like it's a compliance checklist to go through. So you kind of have to tick those boxes and just jump over that hurdle. And we really don't mean that in the book. In the book, governance is a way of creating AI systems from conception to deployment that has the right checks and balances and processes and steps in there all the way through that journey. So it's not a thing you do at the end and check a bunch of boxes. It's stuff that happens throughout the life cycle. And that stuff that happens involves people, it involves their workflows and processes, and those people will be different stakeholders that can be drawn from security teams, privacy teams, often and central risk management teams. There'll be data scientists, there'll be machine learning engineers. They'll use technologies and tools for their work. There'll be other things like an ethics board, which has a role there to play if a board needs to be convened under certain circumstances. There'll be things like model cards, documentation. It's just a whole apparatus of activity that has to come together. So governance is actually uplifting the way we develop AI. And so I don't see it as we try and say it's not a negative thing. It's not just risk management. It's healthy, good way of developing AI so that it does what you want it to do. And ultimately, it actually helps your customers. I think on the people side within organizations, I'm a firm believer that AI should augment people's roles, and AI should be used as a tool rather than something to replace the jobs that people do. Now, a lot of organizations say the same thing, which is great, right? I mean, it's really, really good to hear. But I think we need to make that happen. And by making that happen, what I mean is ensure that every use case of AI deployed within a company, and we are deploying AI within banks to do things that are non-customer facing, that deployment of AI for our colleagues helps uplift the work they do, makes their jobs more interesting, allows them to do things that they wouldn't normally do. And that will also entail creating new roles around probably data management, data labeling, data curation. My role, AI ethicist, responsible AI people. There's all sorts of roles which I certainly can't define yet, but my personal recommendation is organizations should seek out how to define those roles in a way that ensures that AI is used as the tool to help in those roles and help people in existing roles. So that's really important and fundamental to what I think AI should be used for. And to your earlier point, everything is underpinned by learning and a learning and development culture. So the many organizations, and I see Ray nodding, are going on a journey of educating all of their workforce on AI, even people who are non-AI practitioners, teaching them about AI, not technically at all, but, the high level risks, how you should interact with it, how you should use it. the importance of learning and development for particular personas. So your legal department, what do they need to know about AI from their perspective? Your privacy folk, what do they need to, your data scientists, so they'll all have different specialist skills that they will need to uplift and augment so that they can play their part in the governance framework. So none of this works without all of that also being in place.
Yeah.
Could I just add a quick example there, Tim? Because Paul and I were actually last week in New York presenting at the AI Summit, and I went to listen to a talk by somebody else who was the CIO at Paramount, and he said basically they have introduced Copilot across the organization, and he said we thought we did everything right. We were very careful how we introduced it. We gave people training and so on, but we didn't see uptake. We didn't see people getting value out of it or using it. And he said it was only when we actually sat down with each individual business team and worked with people to understand what they do in their day-to-day jobs and how AI and a tool like Copilot could help them in their jobs. That was the point at which they kind of were willing to dig in and grasp it. And then we saw real uptake and real value coming out of it. So I think it goes beyond kind of, oh, well, here's a half-hour training that everybody in the company should take. It's a video, you should watch it, and then you're going to be, all fine. It needs more than that if you really want to get the value out of it and help people to find the ways that it can empower them.
Yeah, I love that. And I think there's a theme there around relevance. So often when we're talking around how do we get more people across the UK from every different community, every different age group to engage with AI, the challenge and often the feedback we get from when we talk to those people is that they don't see how it's relevant to their lives. So then the challenge for us, whether we're building products or services or tools or whatever it is to try and get more adoption from those people, is showing them how it's relevant, how it can actually help them in their day-to-day existence. And it's kind of the same point here, isn't it? Just, in that example you gave, showing how it's relevant to those individual workers. But I wanted to kind of link that to governance as well, right? Because part of the challenge, I think, with governance, just the word itself, regulation, all these words, they immediately evoke a sort of sense that someone's trying to control from a top-down perspective. It's not very empowering for those individuals. It's not really relevant to their lives. So how do you get individuals in the organization to actually engage with these governance frameworks once you've built them?
I mean, I do think it comes back to training on the one hand, and particularly as we see an increasing, prevalence of tools like Copilot that are very generic, they're very open-ended, they're potentially going to everyone in the organization. You can't govern that entirely with a set of rules and technical controls. You have to rely on people themselves understanding what they should and shouldn't do, what they can and can't do. So, there's some embedded, there's a need for individuals to take personal responsibility, if you like, for their use of the tools. So that's the first point. The second point, I think, is you do just have to build questions and checks into day-to-day work routines. So let's say that you're, the data science team and you're developing some sort of new system. Most organizations will have some kind of data science lifecycle control process. They will have steps that they go through, which are standard sort of steps and approvals, that there'll be agreement on a use case, there'll be selecting some data, they'll be testing the data, they'll be building a model, they'll be testing the model, steps they go through. So you want to just build your AI questions, if you like, because governance is little more than questions, in at the right steps in the process. The worst thing that you can do is to have it, as Paul mentioned before, as a checklist at the end, because that's really bad, because if you only ask the questions at the end and then you find problems, people have to go right the way back to the beginning. So you really want to bake it into people's day-to-day work routines so that when they get to the end, they would automatically pass any kind of governance check because, of course, they've thought about it and done the things they need to do.
Mm. And Paul, I wonder whether I can bring you in here as well. I was talking to one of our members yesterday, and they're sort of in the regulatory compliance space. They built a tool. It's kind of a dashboard. that allows them to see across an organization what people are reading about, and it summarizes the context. It's using a AI powered tool to see all of the content that's being consumed, all of the processes, the work that's being done across the organization, to then look at the trends and identify where there's friction and all these kind of things across the organization. But then they kind of link that to a regulatory framework, a governance framework, so they can actually understand where they need to adapt that. So from your perspective, are you seeing more AI powered tools like that are actually enabling organizations to start to better serve and surface the needs of those individuals in the organization, that then means that governance framework can be a bit more dynamic?
Yes, in part, Tim. If your question is, am I seeing organizations use AI to help the governance process and support it? In part we are. I mean, for example, I know of one bank whose risk team are using an LLM to do risk management. So they're finding uses of it in their day-to-day work for either surfacing information or checking the content of a spreadsheet against what an AI system is doing, and they're using AI to do that kind of matching. So there are workflows where AI, especially large language models, is really amenable. And typically it's really anything that's to do with searching, sorting, filtering, and potentially matching text. And there's a lot of jobs. There's a lot of jobs that do that in organizations like banks and banking and insurance. There's a lot of what people do every day does actually boil down to that. So I am seeing it, but a word of caution there. I tend to say to people, don't use AI as the core technology to do any kind of governance or risk management. Again, use it to support the work that you do day to day. So there should be conscious decisions of not using it for certain things. So for example, this comes to mind, an organization's ethics board members had the idea of training an LLM to be an ethics board member, which struck me as rather odd. You kind of, ethics, okay, first of all, ethics is a slightly murky subject, but it's a human thing. It's about values. You kind of wouldn't want an AI to be part of that when the thing you're actually thinking about is the AI as well. So that kind of circular thing of using it, and we see LLM as a judge, as a concept used quite a lot actually, whereby if you have an AI system and you want to validate whether the response it gives you is factually accurate or appropriate or whatever, you use another LLM to have a look at the answer and make a decision of yes, it's good enough, or no, it's not. And again, that kind of circular thing of using AI to make an assessment of other AI, I think we just have to be really careful that that's done properly. Otherwise, I think we could just be running away with AI all over the place. But going back to your original question, yes, it can be used. I've seen it, but it's only used as a tool to support function in risk.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you both. We're going to have to start to wrap things up there. I know we could talk around so many of these topics for much longer, but just in terms of, one last kind of closing thought, what are the areas that you're most excited about as you look ahead to 2026 when it comes to AI governance? And I'll come to you first, Ray.
So I think the fact that we're definitely seeing a lot more organizations proactively turning to AI governance. If I go back a few years, it was really not high on people's agenda. But I think hand in hand with their desire to use AI and to scale AI, they recognize that they do need to have some controls in place to make sure that it goes well. So as I said at the outset, I'm a strong believer in the power of AI throughout my whole career. The thing that's always excited me is the power of technology to do fabulous things. And AI is the next evolution of that. And it's particularly powerful. I just think it's great that people are recognizing that we need to do it in the right way if we're going to get the right results. So that sort of groundswell of recognition is exciting.
Yeah, thank you. That definitely makes sense as the whole industry matures and the understanding of how the technology can both empower humans, but also then needs to be governed at the same time. And Paul, sort of a similar question, but I wanted to look at it through the lens of responsible AI, because I know that's the area that you could have really specialised in there. So, thinking of responsible AI, what are the things you're most excited about when you look at 2026?
You know what, Tim? I think it's the kind of excitement it generates amongst people that I work with. So I have a lot of people that want to do the role that I do or work in my team, which is lovely. I mean, it's really nice, obviously. But what that gives me great comfort in is that there are a lot more people out there that really feel strongly about AI ethics and responsible AI. They recognize the harms, whether that's impact to jobs, impact to society, or just AI systems failing for companies and making mistakes. They recognize that this is a real problem, and they want to be able to use AI, remove those risks, and in fact, get AI to help society and help us as individuals live better lives, have a better society. And I'm really heartened by seeing so many people that actually really come to me and with that kind of feedback. So on a personal note, that's really satisfying. I think on a professional note, it also means that I think more and more organizations will employ people to do the kind of role that I do, right? Your responsible AI or your AI ethicist role. I certainly believe as we experiment with more and more use cases, we will unfortunately see other mistakes happen from badly deployed AI where the governance hasn't been done properly or sufficiently robustly. So although I'm not looking forward to an incident, I'm looking forward to the kind of work that I do and the kind of teams I work with increase in different organizations. And if that happens, I'll be absolutely thrilled. I'll also, Tim, very much in 2026, looking forward to lots of feedback on the book that Ray and I published with Miriam. And as I say to everyone that buys it, please give me feedback. Tell us what we missed. Because you never know, there might be another version at some point, but I'd really like to just mention that.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think. Well, maybe we'll have to do another session at some point next year and actually get some more detailed feedback on the book and how it's gone down and some of the things you've learned as you're planning that second edition as well. Just on responsible AI for a minute, Paul, there, I wanted to sort of also get your perspective on something that at UK AI we talk about a lot, which is the UK's opportunity to lead in responsible AI, because it feels like there's a lot of very unique assets that the UK has in terms of the legal system, the professional services industry, the language, the culture, the education, so many assets there. But I mean, you're really at the coalface there. What's your perspective on the UK's opportunity to lead there?
Oh, I think it's massive, Tim. I think we should really step into that space proactively. We are. So the UK government, the FCA, the banking regulator, they engage a lot on this topic. We have, of course, the UK AI Security Institute, which was the Safety Institute, that are doing some leading work on mitigating the risks of frontier models, those leading edge models. I think we have the right balance here. In the EU, there is the EU AI Act. So that's legal now, and if you don't comply with the act, then there are penalties. We don't have such an act in the UK as such, and it looks like we won't have. But there's enough guidance and principles, voluntary principles, published by many organisations like DCIT, like the FCA, like the UK government, like the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office. There's so much good stuff out there. And although it is voluntary, the push to actually implement that within organisations means that I think it's actually going to work without it being, let's say, too onerous. So striking the right balance by encouraging innovation and getting people to voluntarily do the right thing, I think striking that balance is hard. But I think we're getting there. It still needs work in the UK to ensure it gets there. But there's a real pro-innovation approach in the UK, and I think let's keep guiding that. Let's keep working together to ensure that path continues. So we don't stifle innovation. We don't make it hard for companies to innovate. But at the same time, we mitigate the risks.
Tim, I'm also really encouraged to see the government encouraging and supporting third-party assurance as an ecosystem, which ties in exactly to what Paul was saying, and your point. I think this is something that we could really develop as an industry, as a capability in the UK, test it here. Also, the government's put out its consultation on sandboxes. These are all things that, and that's built a lot off of what the FCA's done. It's fantastic work, which is, world leading in sandboxes. So there's a lot there that I think we can do and then take as an export, frankly.
Yeah, great. And it's been awesome to hear from your expert opinions on that, because I think that's going to be one of the areas that the UK can lead and should lead in as we go into 2026. It's something that as UK AI we've been really sort of championing as an area where we can continue to lead, and just comparing the amount which is spent on, you mentioned AC, the millions of pounds have been spent on that. It really is the largest that any country has spent looking at safety and security, even more so than the US, definitely more so than China. So in terms of the expertise that we have here in the UK, I think that is phenomenal. Going to have to wrap things up there, unfortunately, guys, but we have covered such a wide variety of topics within this conversation around governance. I think it just shows the importance and the integral nature of governance to any organization, whether it be large or small. But it's one of those things that you have to show how relevant it is to people's lives. And you've talked a lot about how you empower people. It should be something which is setting the standards, and that's actually the way you get good, high quality output and really effective companies, ethical companies. So setting the standards is kind of moving up rather than seeing as a burden or a regulatory which kind of contains and sort of controls. So I think that was a really key topic that came through in this conversation, and we've talked a lot about what it means to be responsible as well, and some of the skills and training that we need to have in place here. So it's been fascinating to hear all of that with you. I think the book is going to be something which it would be a really good start for people to get in, read, understand this in a lot more detail. There's so much detail in there about how to get started and follow up on all of these topics. So governing the machine, out now at all good bookshops. Looking forward to hearing how that goes next year. But Ray and Paul, thank you so much for joining us today on the Business of AI podcast.
Great.
Thank you, Tim.